Hello and welcome to tonight's talk with David Innes on the Arnhem campaign. If you haven't been to the museum lately, please do come along. We have our last couple of weeks of the Royal Photographic Society, which is a fantastic photographic exhibition in the Cloister Gallery, which is then followed by John Newt, a personal collection to do with World War II and art. Tonight's talk has been supported by Martin Baker again, and we're really grateful to them for the ongoing support that they give to the museum. David will also be joined after the talk with Ingram Murray and Steve Berridge, both volunteers here at the museum and both experts in the field of Arnhem. David's talk will focus on the Oxf Bucks and the 1944 campaign and the amazing stories, even though it was only a short campaign, that the soldiers experienced. If you're able to donate tonight, please do so. We're always grateful to any funds that come into the museum, not only to support the online talks, but also to help things like this, the interactive glider. Please do try and come along to the museum, and we look forward to seeing you.
On the night of the 17th September 1944, one of the rifle companies of the 2nd Parachute Battalion reached the north end of the great road bridge over the River Rhine at Arnhem in Holland. They had landed 7 miles away to the west during that afternoon. Of the Parachute Brigade, comprising 3 parachute battalions, the 2nd Battalion, depleted in strength because one of its companies was delayed by enemy action in Arnhem, was the only battalion to make it to the bridge, which was the brigade objective. They were later joined by elements of the headquarters of 1st Parachute Brigade, members of the Recce Squadron, Royal Engineers, and anti-tank guns. The 2nd Parachute Battalion plan had been to seize the bridge at both ends, but it had proved impossible to get troops across the river for this. On his own initiative, the company commander of A Company, Major Digby Tatham Water, decided he could delay no longer, and he sent one of his platoons up onto the bridge with covering fire provided by 2 other platoons, which were in hastily defended positions close to the bridge. The platoon commander sent up onto the bridge that night was Lieutenant Jack Grayburn, who led his men up the steps onto the bridge. Sticking close to the massive steel girders on either side of the bridge, his platoon charged against the fire of a German armoured car and 20mm twin flak guns. Grayburn was hit in the shoulder and other men were wounded, so his small force had to withdraw. Of this incident, Anthony Beaver wrote, "Grayburn, who won the Victoria Cross for this action, seems to have been determined to display conspicuous gallantry." Both Digby Tatham Water and Jack Grayburn had started their military lives in the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. Tatham Water had been commissioned into the 2nd Battalion, the 52nd, in 1938. He was the officer depicted in the film A Bridge Too Far, wielding an umbrella, which he carried to assist his own troops to identify him because of his password forgetfulness. Actually, there are reports that on one occasion he used the rolled-up umbrella to disable a German armoured car simply by thrusting it through an observation slit in the vehicle and incapacitating the driver. Grayburn had been commissioned into the 43rd, the 1st Battalion of the regiment, in 1940 and had transferred to the Parachute Regiment in June 1943, serving with the 2nd Battalion in North Africa and Italy. His family had lived for a time in Chalfont St Giles in Buckinghamshire. These 2 officers, who had transferred into the 2nd Battalion of the newly formed Parachute Regiment, were not the only ones. The second in command was Major David Wallace. He'd been commissioned into the 4th Battalion of the Oxf Bucks. This was a territorial army battalion and served in France in the defence of the Dunkirk perimeter in 1940 and transferred to the 2nd Parachute Battalion in April 1944. He had known John Frost, the commanding officer of the 2nd Battalion, since before the war. They were friends and made a good team. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. The Arnhem story in September 1944 is well known. For all that it ended in defeat for the British airborne effort, it's an exciting tale along with the subsequent defence of the Oosterbeek perimeter and the final surrender or escape of the survivors. What is less known is the contribution of the men of the county regiment, the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, in Operation Market Garden, which it was very much hoped would end the war by the end of 1944. This contribution, mostly by individuals, is what we're talking about this evening, and it's been uncovered here in some details in the museum by one of our volunteer researchers, Steve Berridge. It is Steve who has since 2014 been compiling the daily circulation on this day, which many members of the Lightbulbs Google group have found so interesting and which often raises comment and online discussion. The Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, and the wider regimental interest too, has much for which to thank him. The overall name given to the operation was Market Garden. Market, you may recall, was the airborne element of the operation, with 3 Allied airborne divisions being dropped behind enemy lines in Holland with the task of capturing and holding, until relieved by ground forces, all the bridges along a corridor from the Belgian-Dutch border along a single road to the River Rhine at Arnhem. 2 American airborne divisions were to capture the bridges around Eindhoven and Nijmegen, and the British 1st Airborne Division, along with the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade, the bridges at Arnhem on the Rhine. The 1st Airborne Division included 2 parachute brigades, the 1st and the 4th, and the 1st Air Landing Brigade. Garden was the land-based element of the operation, with the main thrust along the corridor to be made by 30 British Corps under General Brian Horrocks, whose plan was to advance up the corridor, linking up with the airborne divisions as he went. The hope was that this force could get to Arnhem in 4 days. From there, the British Second Army could cross the Rhine, the last natural barrier, and then turn south into the Ruhr and the heart of Germany itself, and so end the war by the end of 1944. As we know, this force got bogged down and never made it to Arnhem. It's of note that the 1st Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, part of the 53rd Welsh Division in 12 Corps, was at the time of the Arnhem battle not far away in the Eindhoven area. Broadly over the 10 days between the 17th and 26th of September, this is what happened. Day 1, 17 September. At 1 p.m, the gliders carrying the 1st Air Landing Brigade, divisional staff, transport and guns land at Landing Zone S. They were preceded by the Pathfinders, who marked the dropping zones and landing zones. 1 hour after the gliders landed, the 1st Parachute Brigade, under the command of Brigadier Gerald Lathbury, drops on dropping zone X. Some had boarded their Dakota aircraft for this operation at Royal Air Force Broadwell in Oxfordshire, about 2 miles west of present-day Brize Norton. Lathbury, another key personality in the story, had been commissioned in 1926 into the 43rd, the 1st Battalion of the regular regiment of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. The 1st Air Landing Brigade, under Brigadier Pip Hicks, stays behind to protect the dropping and landing zones for the subsequent landings. A coup de main party of the 1st Airborne Division Reconnaissance Squadron, destined for the Arnhem Road Bridge, is ambushed and largely destroyed. The parachute battalions advanced to Arnhem along 3 separate roads commanded by Lathbury. Only the 2nd Parachute Battalion, on the southern of the 3 routes to Arnhem, and under the command of Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, manages to reach the main bridge at Arnhem. It is on this night of 17 September that A Company of Frost's battalion attempt to take and hold the north end of the Arnhem Bridge. The 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions, on their routes through the town, are held up by German troops. One of the officers in 21st Independent Parachute Company, responsible for marking the landing and dropping zones, to assist the glider-borne and parachute troops coming in, was Lieutenant Herbert David Eastwood, who had been commissioned into the regiment in 1940. During the largely disastrous Sicily landings in the summer of 1943, he had been a staff officer in Headquarters 1st Airborne Division. Following his return to England after Sicily, he was asked by Lieutenant General Browning, commander of the 1st Airborne Corps, to give advice to the D-Day planners about his air landing experiences. For his actions at Arnhem, Eastwood was awarded the Military Cross. The citation stating that
this officer led his platoon with great gallantry throughout the action. On the evening of 18th September, he was detailed with his men to put out navigational aids on landing zone Lima for a supply drop. He found the enemy in occupation of this area in some strength and immediately attacked them, killing or capturing the lot.
Day 2, 18 September. German resistance on the first day was stronger than expected, and only Frost's 2nd Battalion got through to the main objective, along with elements of other units. Tatham Water, commanding A Company, and very aware of his light infantry grounding, had trained his men to respond to bugle calls because he wasn't confident of the effectiveness of the radios at the time. The divisional commander, Major General Roy Urquhart, he is in the centre of this picture, and Lathbury were both missing, so command of the division was now in the hands of Brigadier Pip Hicks of the 1st Air Landing Brigade. Lathbury's absence as brigade commander meant that Frost had assumed command of the 1st Parachute Brigade, and command of the 2nd Battalion was in the hands of the 2nd in command, Major David Wallace. Wallace, a pre-war territorial officer, had transferred into the parachute regiment from the Oxf Bucks earlier in 1944. Tragically, he was killed on the night of the 18th. German troops had overrun 2 of A Company's outlying positions, and Wallace visited the company headquarters to see what could be done. As he left the house, he was hit in the chest by machine gun fire and died instantly. The shots which killed him came from a building nearby defended by sappers of 9 Field Squadron Royal Engineers. A fellow officer said that David Wallace was quietly spoken, and when challenged by a sentry, his answer was not heard and he was fired on. Command of the 2nd Battalion passed to Tatham Water, the company commander of A Company, whom we've already met. The 1st and 3rd Parachute Battalions, together with the 2nd Battalion South Staffordshire Regiment, advanced to Arnhem, but do not progress further than the St. Elizabeth Hospital. In the village of Oosterbeek, on the west side of Arnhem, General Urquhart and Brigadier Lathbury are forced to hide in a house nearby during the chaotic fighting. At 3 p.m, the 4th Parachute Brigade under Brigadier Sean Hackett drops at Hinkle Heath. One of its battalions, the 11th Parachute Battalion, is immediately sent to Arnhem via the southern route. 4 battalions, the 1st, 3rd, 11th Parachute Battalions and the 2nd South Staffs, are ordered to reinforce the troops at the bridge, but do not succeed in breaking through the German blocking line. The 2 remaining battalions of the 4th Parachute Brigade attack the Germans according to the original plan, but are checked by the strength of the German opposition at Drijenseweg, north of the Utrecht-Arnhem Railway. Yes, Lathbury and Urquhart, what had happened to them? There was a good deal of confusion as the 3 parachute battalions made their way on their separate routes towards Arnhem after landing on 17 September. Initially, these 2 senior officers, with their escorts, moved separately on different routes. but because of the very poor radio communications, they were forced to meet up on the 3rd Parachute Battalion route, the central of the 3 routes, in order to confer. Then they found themselves unable to separate when enemy activity around them prevented Urquhart from returning to his original line of advance. Of this very frustrating time, General Urquhart later said,
"As I approached my jeep to try to call Divisional HQ, I saw it had been struck by a mortar. My signaller was badly wounded and was being removed by stretcher bearers. The radio set was intact, but was clearly not working properly. I failed to make contact, and so did Lathbury on his set. Now I realised that I was losing control by being away from my own HQ. I was dissuaded from returning, as this would have meant passing through areas which were not now in our own hands. After some searching moments, I decided that at least I was now with the brigade charged with the initial thrust to the bridge, and therefore usefully placed to give on-the-spot instructions. But I cursed the appalling communications and wished to know more of what was going on elsewhere."
As events unfolded, these two found themselves stuck, besieged really, in a house with German tanks and self-propelled guns closing in, enemy mortar bombs and small arms fire all around. They got away eventually, but as they escaped, disaster struck.
We ran through a passageway where our studded boots made a tremendous echoing noise, and out into a narrow cobbled street. 2 officers had gone ahead of us, and now one of them called a warning. He had seen us turn right in the direction of St. Elizabeth Hospital at the end of the street, where he knew there were Germans. But we failed to hear him. Summoning others, he came after us. Now there were 4 of us running along this street, which had intersections on the left side every 20 yards. As we passed the first of these, a Spandau opened fire from the top end. We ran on, and as we were passing the second intersection, Lathbury was hit by a burst and fell. The 2 young officers and myself managed to lift him past the street corner into a terraced house, number 135 Alexander Straat, where an astonished Dutch couple in early middle age watched us in silence. We laid Lathbury on the floor, not dangerously wounded. He had been partially paralysed by a bullet which had nicked his spine, but he was bleeding and still conscious. All of us knew he could travel no farther. The Germans knew roughly where we were, and it would be senseless to try to take them on. As if he knew what we were thinking, Lathbury urged us, "You must leave me. It's no use staying. You'll only get cut off."
After some hurried farewells, Urquhart and his party left to rejoin the parachute troops. The wounded Lathbury became a prisoner. There are 2 other regimental stories on the 18th of September here. The first about Major John Frederick Bernard Blatch, who had been commissioned into the territorial Buckinghamshire Battalion of the regiment in 1939. After serving with his battalion during the Battle for France and being wounded in the withdrawal to Dunkirk, he was subsequently evacuated to England and later joined the Glider Pilot Regiment. By September 1944, he was second in command of No. 2 Wing in the regiment, and on the 17th of September took off at the controls of a glider from RAF Broadwell, bound for Arnhem. Bad weather forced him down before he crossed the coast, but he landed safely and the next day took off again. Over France, his tug aircraft was hit by flak and his glider suffered severe aileron damage, which again required him to force land, fortunately in British lines near the Albert Canal. In spite of his efforts to rejoin his wing in the Arnhem area, he was unable to do so. He was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his flying skills in landing his aircraft safely and saving the lives of those on board. The second story is that one of those who landed that day was Major Oliver Peter Haig, who had been commissioned into the 4th Territorial Battalion of the regiment in June 1939. At Arnhem, he commanded the Divisional Provo Company of the Royal Military Police, and he said this about his landing that day.
I was with part of the parachute element of divisional headquarters, and we were detailed to drop on D+1, 18th of September, our dropping zone being about 6 miles west of Arnhem and just north of the river. As the main landings had been carried out the previous day, the Boche had started to react, and we ran into a curtain of flak over a wood on the way in, and 3 planes were shot down. We landed in the right place, but found we were under fire. Not heavy, but sufficient to be unpleasant. It turned out to be some SS youngsters who were doing the shooting. They soon shut up when they saw the form.
Day 3, 19 September. The attempts in the town of Arnhem to fight through to the British force holding the northern end of the main road bridge had failed, and the survivors fell back to the little village of Oosterbeek. The units which had been defending the DZs and the LZs had now moved towards Oosterbeek as well, having been almost overrun trying to defend landing zone L for the Polish glider lift. The first of the many brave attempts by the Royal Air Force to resupply the 1st Airborne Division now took place, flying through an ever-increasing anti-aircraft defences that the Germans were moving into position. Lieutenant Herbert David Eastwood of the 21st Independent Parachute Company was again in action this day. His Military Cross citation said,
On 19th September, he again returned to the landing zones to assist in the landing of further gliders. As soon as the aircraft appeared, the enemy put in an attack. This was driven off, and the enemy held until all the gliders had been unloaded. Later, he found that his route back to his company area had been cut by the enemy, but he successfully led his platoon through the enemy positions.
Eastwood continued to be in the thick of the action throughout the battles to come. Day 4, 20 September. Reinforced by around 1,000 men of the 1st and 4th Parachute Brigades, 2nd South Staffordshires and the 7th King's Own Scottish Borderers, the horseshoe-shaped Oosterbeek position has a total strength of around 3,600 men, little more than 30% of the troops who have landed. The furious defence of this position by the Staffordshires on this day resulted in 2 Victoria Crosses. The force at the bridge had to give up, so the Germans were able to move freely to the south. This was the scene at the bridge that morning. Out of ammunition, God save the King, the last radio message from the bridge at Arnhem. On this day, 2 officers of the regiment died. The first was Jack Grayburn. You'll remember that he was the platoon commander in A Company who was badly wounded on the 18th in the assault at the north end of the bridge. His citation for the Victoria Cross included this.
Later, he successfully organised the occupation of a house vital to the defence of the bridge. Although heavily attacked throughout the next day and night, thanks to Lieutenant Grayburn's courage, leadership and skill in disposing his men, the house was held until it was set on fire on 19th of September and had to be evacuated. Lieutenant Grayburn then formed a fighting force of elements of all arms, including the remainder of his company. Although wounded again, this time in the back, he refused to be evacuated. When tank attacks, against which he had no defence, finally forced his retreat on the 20th of September, he stood up in full view of the enemy and directed the withdrawal of his men to the main defensive perimeter. For nearly 4 days, despite pain and weakness from his wounds, shortage of food and lack of sleep, Lieutenant Grayburn displayed supreme and unflagging gallantry and determination. Without his inspiring leadership, the Arnhem Bridge could not have held for so long.
He was 26, and his memory is commemorated in many places, I'm sure, including Amersham in Buckinghamshire, where he played rugby. The second officer who died that day on the 20th was Captain Edward Moy Thomas, who had been commissioned into the 2nd Battalion of the regiment in 1940 and had been in Sicily and in Italy. He was killed while serving as a staff captain in Headquarters 1st Air Landing Brigade. 3 other officers died in the same mortar attack. He was 34. That same day, Captain Donald Robson of the 2nd Battalion of the Oxf Bucks was wounded in the arm. At the time, he was a staff officer in Headquarters 1st Air Landing Brigade. Day 5, 21 September. 1st Airborne Division's perimeter is holding firm, but is under pressure from tanks and assault guns supporting the SS Panzer Grenadiers attacking them. German attacks are backed by heavy mortar and artillery barrages. The British artillery is around the old church near the Rhine. The eastern side of the perimeter is defended by remnants of 3rd Parachute Battalion, 2nd Battalion South Staffordshire Regiment, divisional troops, 21st Independent Parachute Company, the Pathfinders, and some remnants of 4th Parachute Brigade, 7th King's Own Scottish Borderers, and troops from 156 and 10 para-battalions. The western side of the perimeter is held by the 1st Battalion, the Border Regiment, engineers and glider pilots. These airmen, mostly senior ranks, made a major contribution in the battles at Arnhem. Initially, of course, they were engaged after landing in the defence of the landing zones, but later they found themselves often leading mixed groups of infantrymen, engineers and medics. As part of their significant defensive role in the Oosterbeek perimeter, it was the glider pilots who were to mark out the escape route to the riverbank for the survivors of the 1st Airborne Division a few days after this. On 21 September, movement in some forward positions is becoming difficult during daylight. In the afternoon, elements of the 1st Independent Polish Parachute Brigade dropped to the south of the river near the village of Driel and attempt to link up with the Airborne Division in the perimeter to the north of the river. They should have arrived at least 24 hours earlier, but bad weather in England had delayed their departure. A note here about 1st Airborne Division Headquarters Defence Platoon. In June 1944, the 2nd Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry, the 52nd, had become well known as one of the key D-Day assault battalions in Normandy as part of the 6th Airborne Division. They took Pegasus and Horsa bridges. Earlier in the war, however, the battalion had been part of the 1st Airborne Division and at that time had provided the defence platoon for the divisional headquarters. This defence platoon was retained in Headquarters 1st Airborne Division when the 52nd was transferred to the 6th Airborne Division for the Normandy landings. By September 1944, the divisional defence platoon included men from other units, of course, but most were still from the 52nd. During the defence of the Oosterbeek perimeter, the defence platoon was deployed around the Hartenstein Hotel, which was the divisional headquarters. During the action at Arnhem, 6 men of the 52nd Divisional Headquarters Defence Platoon were killed in action. These were Privates Bass, Barton, Lansdowne, Mathieu, Smith and Toes. 3 of them have no known grave. Day 6, 22 September. The first attempts to get men of the Polish Parachute Brigade across the river in order to bolster the defence of the Oosterbeek perimeter have had only limited success. Only about 150 managed this and joined the defenders in the northern part of the perimeter. All troops in the perimeter are in reasonable defensive positions, but there is no resupply, and the number of wounded in the various aid posts numbers nearly 1,000. For many, the situation is becoming desperate. Day 7, 23 September. Everywhere now shows signs of the Germans' sustained mortar and artillery bombardment. Trees have had their branches blown off and appear stripped of their foliage, making movement around the area difficult, a bit like trying to move through a jungle. All the buildings are pockmarked with roof tiles and doors blown off. The whole perimeter area has shell craters every few yards, and any equipment left in the open has been destroyed or damaged. German snipers and sharpshooters have moved into the inner perimeter area, and constant anti-sniper patrols have to be mounted to remove them. I guess that David Shepard's paintings of this battle capture the scene well. During the night 23-24 September, a second small party of the Polish Parachute Brigade managed to cross the river to lend a hand in the 1st Airborne Division perimeter. Day 8, 24 September. Since the formation of the Oosterbeek perimeter, the 1st Airborne Division had accumulated an enormous number of wounded, both British and German, and by the morning of 24 September, the medical staff had about 1,200 men in their care. That day, Colonel Graham Warrack, the senior medical officer, obtained permission to arrange a truce with the Germans in order to evacuate as many of the wounded as possible into German care. There, of course, they would become prisoners, but they would at least be sure of appropriate medical attention. German vehicles entered the perimeter during the truce and removed about 250 stretcher-bound men, whilst a further 200 walking wounded made their way to the St. Elizabeth Hospital. During the night, a further attempt was made to reinforce the struggling 1st Airborne Division in the Oosterbeek perimeter by crossing troops from the south to the north of the river. This was by a battalion of the Polish Parachute Brigade, along with the 4th Battalion of the Dorset Regiment. It was a forlorn hope, because of a shortage of boats and because the Germans held the dominating Westerbuing heights overlooking the landing sites. Only about 350 men have reached Oosterbeek. Day 9, 25 September. The situation had become hopeless. Only 11% of the supplies dropped by the Royal Air Force has fallen within the perimeter. The troops are exhausted by lack of water, food, and sleep. There is very little ammunition. The attempt to cross the Rhine from the south to the north in order to reinforce the struggling 1st Airborne Division ends in failure. The following evening, a withdrawal takes place under heavy German fire. Day 10, 26 September. During the night, 25-26 September, the withdrawal, codenamed Operation Berlin, takes place under German fire, yes, but also with highly successful indirect fire support from the artillery of 30 Corps from their positions in the Nijmegen area. Boats of the British and Canadian engineers ferry about 2,500 men across the Rhine. This map shows the reduction in size of the Oosterbeek perimeter between the 21st of September and the 25th, and the routes taken by those withdrawing as part of Op Berlin. The weather was also to play a helping hand that night. Major Oliver Peter Haig had been wounded in the arm by an airburst mortar around 2 days before. Remembered this of the withdrawal.
By D+8, the day I was wounded, we were in poor shape. Certain types of ammunition had run out, and no rations had been issued for 3 days. Water had to be fetched from a well, but it was dirty and the excursion to bring it in was dangerous. At 1500 on the 25th of September, we were ordered to withdraw across the river that same night. The withdrawal itself was tricky, as we held barely 1,000 yards of the riverbank, and the last few hundred yards down to the bank was very exposed. The thing was only made possible by the fact that 2 companies of the Dorsets had managed to get over to the north side, our side, of the river the previous night, and their efforts, together with a terrific barrage, kept the Boche busy. It was a dirty, wet night, which was in our favour too. At this point, the river is about 150 yards across, and there were some Canadian sappers from 43 Division working some boats. Having crossed the river, we made our way to Nijmegen.
Here are 2 photographs of some of the survivors. Operation Market Garden is over. But this wasn't quite the end of the story. The interesting postscript is that of the 8,000 casualties of the British 1st Airborne Division at Arnhem, not all were killed during the battle or were taken prisoner by the Germans. Quite a number of men evaded capture. At least 300 of these evaders managed to return to the Allied lines with help from the Dutch resistance. One such attempt to reach friendly forces was Operation Pegasus, when Major Digby Tatham Water successfully led 138, mainly British airborne men, safely across the lower Rhine in collaboration with MI9 and 30 British Corps, with Easy Company, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment of the US 101st Airborne Division, under command for the operation. Some may remember that the wartime activities of this company were popularised in the Band of Brothers film. One of those who got away that night was Gerald Lathbury, the wounded commander of 1st Parachute Brigade. After the war, he reached high rank and was Colonel Commandant of both the Parachute Regiment and the 1st Green Jackets, the successor regiment to the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. The story of the evaders here is that escaping from Arnhem, Tatham Water made his way out of the town with an injured friend and was lucky to fall into the hands of the local area resistance coordinator around the town of Ada, about 12 miles to the northeast of Arnhem. This man was Bill Wildeboer. Because his own injuries were relatively slight, Tatham Water became the area organiser for many other evaders who had got away from Arnhem after the Oosterbeek perimeter folded. The expectation was that the Allied offensive would be maintained and that troops of 30 British Corps would soon cross over to the north side of the Rhine. The hope was that as the Allies got closer, so the evaders would be able to coordinate into groups and carry out useful bits of sabotage behind the German lines. Whilst getting around the various groups and individuals who were hiding out in the countryside around Ada, mostly by bicycle and supported by his Dutch minders, Tatham Water used this forged identity card and lived in a small hidden dugout in the grounds of this house in Ada. As the weeks passed, it became clear that the Germans were in fact building up their strength north of the Rhine, and there were now thought to be 2,000 to 3,000 troops in the Ada area, including a major headquarters in the town itself. Movement was becoming much more difficult, and this of course greatly increased risks all round, especially for the Dutch, who were hosting and helping the evaders. The last phase of this extraordinary postscript was the gathering together of as many airborne evaders as possible. There were about 80 in the Ada area and another 30 to 40 closer to Arnhem. And after much liaison with British troops and others to the south of the Rhine, crossing the river in small boats on the night of 22 October. One of those receiving the evaders as they stepped ashore on the south bank after the crossing was Airey Neve of MI9, pictured here as a prisoner of the Germans before his celebrated escape from Colditz. In the 1930s, Neve had also been a territorial officer in the Oxf Bucks. After the war, Tatham Water, who was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, wrote an account of his experiences, first as an escapee from hospital in Arnhem, and then as an evader over this 4-week period in a little volume, Dutch Courage and Pegasus. In this, he saluted the Dutch civilians who helped the evaders whilst under the heel of the German occupation, saying,
"Except for the resistance fighters themselves, I, probably more than anyone else involved, was in a position to observe the day-to-day bravery of the ordinary Dutch people and their families. It's one thing to show courage in the face of danger when you are trained to meet it, or when it's forced upon you, but it is quite another to go out and look for it when there is really no reason why you should, and when, by so doing, you are jeopardizing the safety of your family and others. In any case, at this stage of the war, the Dutch knew very well that the end was in sight and their ordeal nearly over, and it would have been understandable if they had opted for a lower profile. To the fact that they chose not to take this path, many Allied evaders owed their freedom and, in some cases, their lives.
Notwithstanding the determination, courage and fortitude of all those who took part. Not least, of course, the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade and the Dorsets. The operations at Arnhem in September 1944 failed because intelligence warnings of the strength of German forces in the area were overlooked, because the element of surprise was lost, because the landing zones were too far from the key objectives of the bridge at Arnhem, because the mounting of the operation from the United Kingdom meant that variances in weather conditions played a major part in the delay of some of the airborne forces getting into action. Because radio communications between ground units proved almost hopeless, Tatham Water's use of the bugle in his company proved more than justified. And because the 30 Corps advance, limited to a single highway, was slow and ponderous, allowing time for a rapid and determined German reaction. But for now, and with this view of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission Cemetery at Oosterbeek in mind, let us draw this story to a close with the regimental call of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. All of those 43rd and 52nd Light Infantry officers and men who fought and died at Arnhem would have recognised it.
The question and answer session will start shortly. The Q&A window will open below the video window. Please log in to ask a question.
Good evening and welcome to the live Q&A. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. And a special welcome tonight to Steve Berridge and Ingram Murray, both of whom are with me, although on Zoom from their homes. It is Steve, of course, who did the research which allowed us to tell this story. Both of these, Steve and Ingram, are both volunteers in the museum, and Ingram is a county and regimental historian, really, who already in our series of online talks has given us a very good talk, a fascinating talk with Antonia Keeley of Blenheim Palace about SOE, Special Operations Executive, which was called Subversives, Assassins and Saboteurs, other way around, I think, Saboteurs, right. Assassins and Subversives. But he may be better known to some of you as a voice from the podcasts of the We Have Ways podcasts of James Holland and Ingram's own son, Al Murray, where he is known, I believe, as the Colonel. We'll probably end up calling you the Colonel tonight, Ingram, and I hope you won't mind that. No. We've got an early question in tonight from Henry Spielberg, one of our trustees, who asks really why, with this decision about why the landings were so far from the objectives. Ingram, I wonder if you could pick that up.
Well, the lessons from Sicily and Normandy were that if you want your airborne division to form up quickly and reach its objectives, you don't drop by night and you don't drop from American aircraft. And the airlift, with the exception of the Pathfinders, who were dropped from 38 Group Sterlings, the parachute airlift all came from 9th Truth Carrier Command. And they were not very well trained to fly by night. And they'd already demonstrated in Normandy that they'd scattered their 2 airborne divisions all over West Normandy. So it was decided to do an operation by day and to land them in a manner that that meant they could form up very quickly and head for their objectives. Now, why were the landing zones so far away? And that is because where else do you land 600 gliders in 2 lifts near Arnhem? The area to the west was completely unsuitable, to the east was completely unsuitable. The area to the south was polderland. And the Dutch had advised the Airborne Division that if they dropped their gliders on that, they wouldn't be able to get their vehicles, their anti-tank guns and other vital equipment off the polderland. So the only areas feasible for that number of gliders and parachutists easily found were to the west at Ginkelheide and even further west. And that is where the gliders landed about midday on the 17th, followed by the parachute brigade dropped by the Americans.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Steve, can I bring you into another question which has come in really about the independent parachute brigade, independent parachute company, which was heading for the bridge at Arnhem as a coup de main operation and very quickly got snarled up.
That's right. We're actually talking about the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron in this instance.
Exactly, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
Their job, because the original plan did not allow for coup de main idly, if like at Pegasus Bridge, actually on the bridge area itself, because of the reasons that England's already talked about. The decision was made to mount a vehicle coup de main, if you like, by the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron. This squadron was actually commanded by a rather colourful character by the name of Major Freddie Goff. Now, Major Goff started off his career in the First World War, serving in the Royal Navy as a midshipman. But as far as the Army was concerned and the Royal Green Jacket connection, he was the grandson of a Victoria Cross winner in the Indian Mutiny, who was winning his Victoria Cross serving with the Indian Army. And he was the brother, or rather the Victoria Cross winner was the brother of another Victoria Cross winner, of the, again in the Indian Army. But his son went on to be Johnny Goff, the General Johnny Goff, Victoria Cross holder, who won his Victoria Cross in Somaliland in 1903 with the Rifle Brigade. And he's one of the Victoria Crosses at the Royal Green Jacket Museum. So it's quite an interesting story that Freddie Goff himself is the grandson of a Victoria Cross winner and related to the other 2 Victoria Cross winners as well from his own family. His other connection with the Royal Green Jackets is the fact that in the 1920s, he joined the Territorial Battalion of London Regiment, which was the London Rifle Brigade. And as such, he was commissioned in there and served right through 1920s into the 1930s. He was recalled from the Territorial Reserve Officers at the outbreak of the Second World War, and he found himself in various guises, one of which was during the Finnish campaign in December 1939. He actually volunteered as part of the what was known as the Ski Battalion of the Scots Guards, and the idea was that they were to land in Finland and help the Finnish troops. They didn't actually go at that point, so he ended up going back to the Rifle Brigade, and he then found himself in France in 1940 during the withdrawal as part of one of the Apollo companies. Back in England, he went up to Scotland, where in 1941 he was actually part of the newly formed Reconnaissance Corps, and I think it believed it was with the 52nd Reconnaissance Regiment up in Scotland, but very soon moved down to take over command of what was then the 131st Brigade Reconnaissance Squadron. Now, the 131st Brigade was the brigade that came back from India and Burma in 1940, which contains the battalions that initially made up the 1st Air Landing Brigade of the 1st Airborne Division when that was formed. So that consisted of the Royal Ulster Rifles, the Border Regiment, and the 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. At the end of 1941, the 131st was converted into and became airborne and became the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron. And Major Freddie Goff became its officer commanding. And as such, he commanded that company at Arnhem, along with, in the early days of the squadron, a great many Oxf Bucks soldiers actually volunteered and joined the 1st Airborne Reconnaissance Squadron. By the time of Arnhem, 20 of its former soldiers were still serving with the squadron. Just trying to.
Well, don't worry. That's terrific. Thank you very much. I mean, he was a tremendously colourful character. If anyone was going
post-war, he was a member of Parliament. He ended up as honorary colonel of various regiments, and commanded the honorary colonel of the 16th Lincoln Company, as well as commanding the 11th Battalion, TA Parachute Regiment after the war. So his link with airborne forces continued right through.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. What a colourful is exactly the word for a chap like him. What an exciting time, what an adventurous time they all had in those days. We've got some questions coming in now. One from MKCW. Was Arnhem really a bridge too far, or was the whole enterprise merely too ambitious and part of Montgomery's plan to steam Patton's reputation? Ingram, do you want to have a shot at that?
There's no doubt that Montgomery and Patton were competitors. And in the planning for Market Garden, there was a discussion about putting the division down near the site of the future Rhine crossing. But Montgomery wouldn't have that because it was far too close to the Americans and it would have to be a joint operation with him. Behind all this was competition for resources, because Antwerp had only just been captured on the 4th of September, and all the fuel and ammunition was being brought from Normandy. And there was always pressure from Patton and from Montgomery on Eisenhower to give them the bulk of the resources, particularly the fuel, so that they could pursue their own axes and objectives. And it was an attempt by Montgomery, it is generally believed, to create a situation where Eisenhower would have to give him the bulk of the resources and to make his single thrust, as he called it, towards the Ruhr. So it was then decided to drop the division at Arnhem and the two American divisions, the 82nd and 101st, along the route which 30 Corps was going to follow in order to relieve the first division. So it does stem from that basic competition between Montgomery, who basically thought he knew the answers and the Americans weren't any good at fighting, and Patton, who thought the Limeys were similar and couldn't do any fighting either. So that's a fatal flaw, I think, in Montgomery's character. The risk, well, it was a very, very high risk operation, given the distance the 30 Corps had to cover, given the water obstacles in between. And you could have thought that given that it was such a high risk operation, the plan that was developed for the operation would have taken that into account, and everybody landed on that first day would have gone absolutely flat out for the bridges. As it was, only 2 battalions were tasked to go to that bridge, and Frost Battalion on the Lion route was tasked with 3 objectives. One was the road bridge, one was the headquarters, and one was the rail bridge. So you could argue even then that only 2 of his companies would have probably got to the road bridge. So that was a fatal flaw in the plan. It was a very high risk plan, and the risk was not really taken into account. Do I think the risk was worth it? Yes, I do.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. I've got a question here from Robert Webb. Why was Sosabowski and the Polish effort so maligned? Was the lesson of delayed second lifts learned? I'm sure the lesson was learned, but the Poles had a very difficult time, as we were talking about earlier, Ingram. And the Dorsets and the Polish Independent Parachute Brigade had great difficulty in trying to help those trapped in the Oosterbeek perimeter.
Well, they were 2 days late because of weather, of course. And they were dropped in Driel, which was not their original dropping zone, in the belief that the ferry was still in operation. Well, of course, the Germans had actually smashed the ferry up. So they arrived on the scene, and one of their battalions had been turned back, so there were only 2 battalions and accompanying engineers and so on. Their artillery and anti-tank guns had all been dropped over the other side of the Rhine, so they had very little hardware with them. And then up comes Thomas, the 43rd Division, up comes Browning, and they say that they're going to send a force across the river in assault boats and that sort of thing, and the Poles would have to follow them. Well, Sosabowski didn't like that idea. He didn't think it was a big enough attack to relieve the 1st Airborne. As it was, the Dorsets made an extremely gallant crossing with some Poles, and quite a lot of Poles were ferried across as well, but in dribs and drabs. So that it was an ineffectual operation. And Sosabowski was ignored at the Valbo conference, which was held with Thomas, the 43rd, and he was basically sidelined. And he was a very difficult man anyway. And he was a major general, so he had great experience, and he didn't think the British took the Germans at all seriously. And he'd said that all along. He'd said that at the planning conference, he'd said that at the briefings, and so on. Difficult man, very professional man, and he was blamed by Browning for the disaster, which was a really vicious attempt to explain away on the Poles the failure of Market Garden, a disgraceful episode.
I think that's the view we take these days. I'm sure that's right. There's a very good Polish military museum in London, which bears visiting, I can say to you, and I'm sure the stories there about this will be well told. I'm very pleased to say that we've got a couple of very polite congratulation messages here, one from Chris Davis and one from, I think, Simon Booth Mason. Simon adds that what effect did Arnhem, the operations at Arnhem, have on German strategy immediately afterwards? And on what basis was Montgomery's verdict's 80% success based on? Probably not much. Okay.
This one?
Yes, do. Did you get that? Well, was there any, did you pick up on anything about that? I don't know about that, Ingram, whether German strategy subsequently changed because of Arnhem.
Well, the Germans did a post-action analysis.
Yeah.
And they admired the attempt to capture the bridges, and they said that they actually dropped parachutists to the south of the bridge. The other thing they spotted was that the 82nd was overstretched and wasn't actually tasked with seizing the Nijmegen Bridge, and it was a matter of luck that the guards actually came up. And you probably remember there was an extremely gallant crossing of the Rhine by the 504th Parachute Infantry in British assault boats who paddled across and took the north end. And why wasn't the bridge blown up? Well, there are various arguments, but one quite simple one is that some American airborne soldier got his pliers out and cut the wires. that a sapper officer called Tony Jones got to the wires as well. He was on the third tank going across, and he cut them as well. So they couldn't blow the bridge. And that was a serious disaster from the Germans' point of view. But they recognized they didn't have air superiority, so their options were limited. But they also congratulated themselves on their capacity to reorganize defense and attack with scratch troops at very, very short notice. Of course, one of the features of the operation was the Germans had actually been practicing anti-airborne operations before the landings, which included getting absolutely everybody into the front line: signalers, cooks, bottle washers, clerks, and Luftwaffe people, naval people indeed, all of whom appeared on the perimeter at one time or another. Some of them got absolutely, completely massacred because they were useless as infantry, but they at least held up the British and wasted their ammunition.
The way that the Germans cobbled together forces to resist invasion, resist attack, we also saw in Normandy, didn't we?
Yes.
Absolutely.
There was the Hitler family factor in Normandy, of course, that no one wanted to wake Hitler up till about lunchtime.
Yeah.
So the movement of the 21st Panzer, which was the main threat to 6th Airborne, was delayed until someone had the courage to wake up Hitler and say, "Mein Führer, the British have landed and we need to release the reserves." And then Hitler presumably had a quick lunch and said, "Okay, off you go." And that held up the attack by the 21st Panzer and others onto the beachhead and onto the landing zones.
Okay, that's very good. Thank you very much for that. I've got a question here from Lawrence John Jones. He says his father was in the Royal Artillery and went over as part of the 1st Air Landing Brigade. And his question is, would he have been attached to a particular unit on landing, or did 1st Air Landing have their own set objectives?
Steve?
Right, well, I can't remember the exact designation of the unit itself, but it was armed with the 75mm howitzers or light guns. I don't believe they had an objective as such, but they played a very important role in the defence, certainly of the Easterbeek perimeter when that was set up. Their guns were set up down the south of the perimeter, near the Easterbeek Church, around that kind of area. And they provided the only artillery support to the troops in the perimeter and indeed at the bridge up until the point of when 30 Corps actually reached Nijmegen. So they took over the main defensive fire missions in the Arnhem and Easterbeek area for the 1st Airborne Division. So as I say, they played a very important role. I'm not sure what their objective was on the first day, but that's certainly how it panned out. Giving fire and their fire support was extremely helpful to all concerned, as it's the only one they had until the big guns of 30 Corps come within range.
Steve, thank you very much for that. Of course, their first objective, their first task was presumably to defend the landing sites so that the rest of the Airborne Division could get in safely. I'm going to interrupt the Q&A for a moment here, really to remind everybody that whilst it's jolly nice to have a good number of people attending this talk and have some very complimentary remarks made about the talk, for which thank you, we are very keen that you should consider making a donation to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, and please do that. You can do it either by text or by pressing the button, what's it called, the icon at the bottom right of the screen. Text, what you have to do there is text the word Arnhem followed by a figure, the sum you want to donate, to 70450, and that will get through to us and will be hugely appreciated. Our point is that we are a private museum, we are entirely privately funded, and we depend entirely on donations from the public and what we can earn ourselves. So your help in supporting the museum tonight so that we can do talks like this and other things is tremendously valued, and I can't thank you enough. Very good. On with the questions. More an observation, actually, from Chris Davis about Digby Tatham Water. I met Digby TW in Kenya in 1983. What a unique character. Unforgettable. Such men were an inspiration to successive generations of airborne soldiers. Ingram, you were an airborne soldier. Did you hear about this chap, Tatham Water?
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Book. I've read Frost's book. My quartermaster was a corporal in Eric Mackay's troop on the bridge, and he knew Tatham Water by reputation. And of course, Tatham Water's A Company was probably the single most coherent unit on the bridge. And he was a quite outstanding leader. And of course, he played a very important part later on when the invaders, but
exactly,
among the Dutch, were being evacuated by MI9 across the Rhine. And he had discovered from the Dutch that the telephone lines between the power station at Ede and the power station at Nijmegen were still in operation and worked by Dutchmen. And he set up a link with MI9, with Air Neve of MI9 across the Rhine, and organized the evacuation of a whole lot of evaders in operations which were called Pegasus 1 and Pegasus 2. And Pegasus 1 was organized with the help of Hugh Fraser, Colonel Doby, who actually swam across the Rhine with vital information about this collection of evaders, and with Air Neve and some soldiers from the 101st Airborne, American Airborne, as a protection party on the South Bank. And assault boats were provided by the sappers. Who else? Proper chaps. And they paddled about 186 people across, including Tatham Water. And there was a considerable setup by MI9 in Holland. They parachuted in an agent called Dick Krag, and with a Belgian SAS officer, rallied the evaders, helped the Dutch conceal them, and organized the evacuation. Sadly, Pegasus 2 was a failure. It was ambushed. The Germans had established no-go zones along the banks of the Rhine, and a stupid BBC broadcast told the Germans that it was all going on. A journalist, and here we're reminded of Princess Di, a journalist pretending to be an officer of MI9, interviewed a survivor of the first Pegasus, and this was published and broadcast. And of course, the Germans picked it up, and there they were, raking when Pegasus 2 tried to cross the river. After that, the Dutch and the SAS and MI9 helped a number of other people across in canoes through the marshes. And this included Brigadier Hackett, who'd been badly wounded and had been sheltered by the Dutch. And of the 300 or so evaders, pretty well all of them, including a load of stragglers, some of whom swam across, got away after the final evacuation from the perimeter.
Yes, of course, that operation took place a month later, didn't it?
Yes, and November too.
Yeah.
Pegasus too, I think.
Yeah.
During the winter, so that was pretty cold. Anyway, it was a great success, and it demonstrated once again the efficacy of MI9's organisation in Holland, and by that time they were very good at evacuating people in tight situations like that, like aircrew particularly, who'd been dropped, been parachuted in, who jumped out of their aeroplanes or shot down over Holland.
One of those who got away on the first Pegasus, the successful one, Pegasus 1, was Lathbury, we mentioned earlier.
Yep.
Now, he had a pretty colourful time in Arnhem and got himself into difficulties, but he went on to do great things regimentally and militarily after the war. Steve, what happened in Arnhem which caused him to upset his divisional commander so much?
Right. You may recall that on the 17th of September, on the first day, when the Jeep squadron, the rumour went round that the Jeeps had been badly ambushed and turned up, Urquhart made his way to try and find Brigadier Lathbury to tell him what the situation was. But as I say, you met up with them when they was on the 3rd Battalion route, and they quite quickly came under heavy enemy fire. So the first night they actually had to take cover in one of the houses. On the following day, they decided to make a break and a dash to try and get back to divisional headquarters. And it was during this scurrying through the back gardens and roadways of the Arnhem itself, crossing over a wall, that unfortunately Brigadier Lathbury's Sten gun, notoriously known for doing strange things, actually went off on its own, narrowly missing the general's foot. The general wasn't very happy. Apparently, Gerald Lathbury more or less told his Sten gun off in no uncertain terms. And General Urquhart said he's bad enough being caught out, without divisional headquarters, whatever, let alone be shot by my own brigadier.
Right.
So that went down very well. But it was shortly after that Lathbury was actually shot by the machine gun fire that was spoken about in the talk itself. They actually dragged him into one of the houses, as stated, and in one of the few almost factual parts of the Bridge Too Far film, the scene in the front room of the house is quite accurate, whereby the German presented himself at the window, and the German Urquhart shot him with his Colt automatic. Gerald Lathbury was wounded. He'd been paralysed by the round that actually got very close to his spine, and he was only temporarily paralysed, but they realised that he couldn't carry on any further. So they try and avoid the inhabitants of the house being shot for harbouring a British soldier. His colleagues moved him into the cellar, whilst they then made their escape. And Gerald Lathbury was then moved later on by the Dutch Red Cross to St Elizabeth's Hospital, where he was treated by the medical officer from the 1st Parachute Brigade, who had actually tended to the wounds of Brigadier Lathbury in Sicily. He'd been wounded in the backside there, and the medical officer was quite a note of how well his previous work had turned out. And as a result, basically the St. Elizabeth Hospital was taken over by the Germans, and he became, Lafferty then became prisoner of war, in effect.
Very good, Steve. Thank you very much for that. I've got a question here from Kevin Getz, who I think might even be in the United States. The reputation, he says, of the glider pilot regiment is widely known, including to those of us in the States. But could we both discuss or expand on the crucial role of the Horsa glider, in my opinion, the single best glider of the war? Do you come across the Horsa glider much, Ingram? We certainly saw it very usefully deployed at Pegasus Bridge, didn't we?
I've edited the papers of one of the glider pilot squadron commanders, a man called Taylor, who was at Arnhem. And the story of the Horsa is that at the beginning of the war, there was a lot of argument about what airborne troops were for. Were they for raids or were they for mass landings, such as Market Garden? And an aircraft company was dished out with a specification by the Air Ministry, which was surprising because on the whole, the RAF were extremely unkeen about airborne forces were obstructing the creation of airborne forces as hard as they could. Anyway, this specification was given to the Airspeed Company, who were used to building planes in wood, and in 11 months they had developed the specification for a cargo glider. 25 passengers and 2 pilots, or about 3 tons of cargo. And this was the Horsa. And it took its first flight from an airstrip in West London at the end of 1941. And it was then demonstrated up at Ringway, which was where the parachute school was being established. And it just happened that the American military attaché in London turned up in a Jeep. And everybody looked at this Jeep and said, this is absolutely the thing for airborne forces. It will fit inside the Horsa. And then they tried it, and the chap from Airspeed said, right, you can't do that, the floor isn't strong enough. So they redesigned it, and it underwent 3,000 modifications before it was actually put into service. But in the end, it proved capable of taking a platoon of 28, squashed together, and two glider pilots, or a Jeep and trailer, a light gun that's just been described by Steve, or an anti-tank gun, a 6-pounder. And it was towed initially by some very old bombers, but eventually it was found that the Dakota could pull it, as well as the Halifax, and as well as some other obsolete aircraft like the Albemarle, but the Albemarle couldn't pull it very far, or couldn't pull it very high. So the ideal tug was actually a Halifax, but it was amazing that the Dakota could actually pull them. And 46 Group, which was the Dakota group, pulled in the gliders for Market Garden on that morning of the 17th. And each of them contained a platoon of air landing troops, and the platoon by this time, and the whole organization of the air landing battalions had been built round the Horsa glider. The platoon size, the loads, the logistic loads, the ammunition, the resupply, the mortar platoon, the anti-tank platoon, all that sort of thing. And it took 56 gliders to carry an air landing battalion into action, which is quite a lot of gliders and quite a lot of tugs, if you think about it.
Absolutely, yeah.
Multiply that up to an air landing brigade, That's 300 plus gliders in one go. But it was a marvelous piece of aircraft design. It was very robust. It had enormous flaps, which meant that you could put it into an absolutely breathtaking glide, almost vertical, which is what they did coming down onto Oxfordshire Bridge in Normandy. Big flaps operated by compressed air. And it also had an undercarriage that you could jettison and you could land on a skid, which is an even hairier process than flying in a glider, which nobody really liked. But it was a very successful piece of kit, and it was the vehicle around which the air landing brigades were designed.
Excellent. That's
the one was built by the Assault Glider Trust, and unfortunately, when they got the design from British Aerospace, there was a condition that said under no circumstances is it to be taken into the air. It's now in Holland, that particular one.
That's very good. Thank you very much indeed. It was a major feature of the whole European campaign, the mainland campaign. Those gliders were fantastic, and thank you very much for that. I've got a point for you here, Ingram, from Chris Davis, who you know. Ingram, 9 greetings. I think that means 9 squadron. Your quartermaster must have been John Humphreys, who was 101 last Saturday. Did you know that?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was.
Yep. He escaped by boat with Eric Mackay, Stiffy Timpson, and Chick Weir after capture at the bridge and regained the Allied lines.
Yeah. John had escaped from the Germans twice before. Once in the desert and once in Italy.
Very good.
And he and Eric Mackay, he was captured in the tram depot underneath the tram. And the Germans were so scared of the airborne troops that they brought up a self-propelled gun and said, if you don't come out, we'll shoot. So he was captured and he was carted off to a Dutch barracks, and he knew the drill. So he volunteered to be a cook, which meant that he had access to food. He could be out during curfew, preparing breakfasts or suppers or something like that. And he hid his jackknife in his crutch, because no man searches another man's crutch when he's searching him for weapons. For hours, he unscrewed the bars of the ration store in the barracks. He, Eric Mackay, and the 2 others nipped out, pinched a boat, and went down the Rhine. And there's a lovely PR picture of him or them getting out of their boat somewhere near Nijmegen, which is somewhere on the net. He's a grand lad. 101 isn't bad going, if you think about it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wayne Taylor asked a question about how much of the film A Bridge Too Far was dramatized. Steve has already alluded to the fact that probably only one little bit was true to the action. I've always thought that the music was the best bit about the film, actually.
Absolutely,
but,
yeah. I think as far as the film Bridge Too Far is concerned, it's a very good action film, but you certainly can't use it as a documentary. There are certain events that happen completely different to the way they're portrayed in the film, and likewise the characters. But it did its job at the time of promoting the market garden operation to a much wider audience than was probably available, that knew about it at the time. As I say, a lot, and the props very, very well done, very accurate in a lot of respects. But as I say, it is a film, and so as I say, poetic license ruled quite a lot of some of the script. But say some of it was very good and true to life, but others were a little bit, straight out of somebody's storybook.
Exactly. Okay. I think we're going to draw things to a close at this point. We've been going for a bit now, And I think we've exhausted our two participants in this Q&A who have given tremendously. Thank you both very much indeed. And so I think we'll draw stumps on this evening, which I must say I've enjoyed a great deal. Before we end, I'd just like to make a few thank yous. First of all, to Clive Smith, our filmmaker and film editor, for pulling all this thing together and for managing the live Q&A like this. The talk that you've just heard is available as a recording, or will be from tomorrow on the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum website. So I hope you'll point people towards that if they want to catch up on it afterwards. We've been tremendously well supported tonight, again, by Martin Baker Limited, who are our sponsors. And we are tremendously grateful to corporate Oxfordshire for standing up for us and for helping us in this way. It is tremendously appreciated. And I'm tremendously grateful too to you, the viewers at home, who I hope, one, enjoyed it, that's the most important thing, but secondly, enjoyed it enough to want to make a donation to the Soldiers of Oxfordshire Museum, and we've mentioned that already. A particular thanks to our Q&A specialists, Steve Berridge, whose idea it was in the first place to highlight all these personalities of the regiment and to tell their stories at Arnhem, and Ingram Murray for making such a tremendous contribution to the Q&A tonight. The Colonel, I think we'll call you from now on, Ingram, and that might even cause you to smile a little bit. But we're very grateful to both of you. Thank you very much indeed for putting your shoulders to the wheels so enthusiastically. A special mention of thanks to paradata.org. This is an airborne forces museum organization which made available to us at very short notice the excellent photograph of Colonel Graham Warrack, I should say, the senior medical officer at Arnhem. To our 4 voiceovers. The voiceovers, I think, make a big difference on these occasions, and the 4 voiceovers were provided tonight by Jonathan Cheel, who told the story of Urquhart and the Lathbury wounding. David Lee, himself a former officer of the Parachute Regiment, which is very appropriate tonight as we're talking about Arnhem, who gave us the account from Major Peter Haig. He was the Provo officer, you remember. Will Innes read the citations, and Christopher Marriott read the little bit from Digby Tatham Water's his little book about Dutch courage and Pegasus, about the Het Verzet, the Dutch resistance, which was so valuable in getting those in so much during the occupation, of course, but especially in getting, which is part of our story, getting the evaders out of the clutches of the Germans at the end of it, the Het Verzet. Christopher is the godson of Digby Tatham Water, and I know is a particular pleasure for him to read Digby's words tonight. Looking forward, on the 2nd of February, which is only 2 weeks tonight, we've got a talk with Air Commodore Phil Wilkinson on remembrance, that is to say, the work of the Commonwealth War Graves Commission. So I do hope you'll be able to join us for that. And I got one last thought, which is that Reg Charles celebrates his 100th birthday on the 1st of February, and he lives in Weston-super-Mare. Reg was in the 1st Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. We referred to him as being down in the Eindhoven area as part of 12 Corps. And a few weeks after the operations at Arnhem, Reg had the sobering experience of seeing his own commanding officer mortally wounded in a canal crossing. But tonight, Reg, with you 100 in only a couple of weeks' time, we salute you